This is what's today? The May 12th meeting of the Executive Committee of Whatcom Transportation Authority. Be it noted that at the moment we're still waiting for a few board members, executive committee members to arrive.
We do have Allie now, Michael.
Does that make quorum?
Yes, it does.
Okay, well, the meeting is now called to order. Can we please do a roll call?
Yes, Donovan.
Here.
Hawkinson.
Here.
Lautenbach.
Here.
Lilyquist.
Here.
And we currently have Davidson, Huffman, Cortice, and Darwin absent. Thank you.
Okay, so we'll go ahead and continue in regular order then. First item, sorry for the trying to move the agenda around. First item is discussion of approval of a task order for high frequency corridor study, and that'll be followed by discussion approval of another task order for zero emission fleet transition plan. Both of these have Tim Wilder as presenter. Les, do you want to say anything first or go to Tim?
No, sir, we can just go to Tim. Thank you. Thanks, Tim. And Shonda, thanks for the false start there. That was my fault. Sorry.
Okay, well, good morning, board members. So yeah, as Michael mentioned, we have two task orders. Both are related items. This emerges from our recent on-call contract that we signed with Transpo and sub-consultants. And these have been in the works for some time. We had to back up and make sure they were federally procured because we may be seeking federal dollars that are an outcome to both of these projects. So it's taken us a little longer to get to this point, but so we have these two items today. The first item, we're asking that the executive committee recommend approval to the full board for a task order for the high frequency transit corridor studies in the amount of $155,460. That particular study is the primary purpose of that study is to evaluate the feasibility of one or more bus rapid transit lines in Bellingham. And then secondarily, that effort is also looking at short-term, transit street improvements to improve speed and reliability of our service. So it's those two components that are included in this particular study. This project includes public engagement, formation of a technical advisory committee, and one public meeting, corridor assessments where we'll compare different corridors for evaluation, and then set some goals and objectives and determine whether or not they could qualify for federal funding. And then the second part of this project is, as I mentioned, identifying improvements that could help with speed and reliability, things like queue jumps, things like signal priority, and other kinds of shorter term infrastructure improvements. So we are seeking your recommendation for approval to the full board on this item.
And I note that this is actually already a budgeted expense, but we need to approve the task order. Board members, committee members.
I move we move this to the full board with recommendation for approval.
Second.
Thank you, Jen. And is there any further discussion of this item? Okay, if there's no objection, we'll consider all motions passed unanimously. Are there currently 5 board members here or 4?
We have 4.
Yeah, so if all 4 of us agree, we're going to move it forward to the full board with a recommendation for approval. Or is there any further discussion or any objections passing the motion? Hearing none, that's passed. Thank you very much. Tim, next item.
Okay, this next item is the long-awaited study on the zero emission fleet transition plan. Again, this is coming out of that same contract with Transpo and subs. We will be having Transpo and STV working on this project. We are asking that the executive committee recommend to the board of directors approve a task order for the Transpo group for a zero emission fleet transition plan in the amount of $185,500. This is a very extensive look at the opportunities and the costs and the schedule for transition to a zero emission fleet. And that would include not only fixed route buses, but also paratransit vehicles and support vehicles. So it's basically all of our fleet. The main focus, however, will be on fixed route buses. That tends to be our biggest expenditure. So we have identified in this project 3 board check-ins, the first occurring in June. We have one identified for July and the final in September. And that should be in time for your decision over the 8 diesel bus procurement option. We won't have a final plan ready until at least October, maybe November of this year, but at least we'll have some information for you to discuss when time comes to make a decision on that procurement. So yeah, very extensive work. It includes a technology assessment. That's probably one of the first things we'll share with the board in June. We have identification of our policies. We'll have route planning and analysis so you can see how it affects our operations. And then a big component is our facility needs and also a schedule for procurement based upon availability of funding, readiness of our facilities to accommodate vehicles and that sort of thing. And then the outcome will be a plan that we can all agree on that to move forward in terms of procurement of vehicles in the future and equipment. So with that, turn it over for your approval.
Hey, thank you, Tim.
I move that we recommend this to the full board for approval. I have a question.
I'll
Second.
Okay, we have a motion for us on the table. Todd, go ahead with your comment or question.
Yeah, as far as the decision we have to make by September on the contract that's currently out there, I thought that was more of we're waiting on the performance or an assessment of the performance of the buses that Gillig has sent us. What information would we get from this sort of planning that would help in that on that particular contract?
Yeah, Mike can probably address this better than I can, but I think the main component here is a schedule for procurement. So you know when we should be purchasing vehicles in order to make that 100% transition. That goes beyond just the operational characteristics, because I think we're finding information now, but I don't think that's the main driver in the number of vehicles that we procure in this next order. But Mike might be able to explain that a little better than I can.
Yeah, good morning. I'd like to first correct the information that we need to make a decision by September. We really don't. Gillig, right now we have a build date of basically September of 2023 for these 8 buses we have on order. Right now they're ordered as diesels. To change them to electric, they require about an 8-month lead time, which puts us to the board. If you say January, it would be in December. And for some reason, it's kept on creeping up from November to October to September. We're here now. So that, we have time to wait for this transition plan to be brought to the board for approval before we need to make a decision on those 8 buses. And in fact, the September build date can be pushed out. That is the soonest we can have those buses built to replace the existing buses. So we have time. I hope that helps clear up a few things on this and give the board some time to make a decision.
Yeah, very much.
If I may, yeah, part of this, the zero emission transition plan is also sequencing, being able to look at what the infrastructure development is, the type of electrical charging, whether it's above, below ground, all those kinds of things, and then sequence it with acquisition and so forth. So that's part of it as well. The reason we were recommending October was at that point was to tie to budget. So if we had budget things going into 2023 budget, we could include that in the budget now, as opposed to waiting to come back for an amendment in January or whatever. So those were some of the reasons behind that.
Any further discussion? I had a thought, now I can't remember what it is. So as Les and I were talking about earlier this week, this would be a major initiative, but in WTA 2040 long-range plan, we also discussed other significant initiatives with regard to service and scope of service and type of service. And so the ultimate decision, this isn't the only forward-looking effort that the WTA is contemplating in the next, say, decade or so. So I think that's also needs to be factored in. And I believe we're going to be queuing up some discussions on those also between now and September budget time.
Yes, sir. And yeah, some of those things that are identified in 2040 on the kind of a programmatic approach are things like studying the on-demand to extend out to other areas, the TDM, transportation demand management, the BRT, as Tim talked about on the other one, land use and transit. There's also transit-oriented development possibilities with underutilized properties and things of that nature. So there's a number of things that WTA raised and that we need to consider going forward as we look at budget and how we get a good return on investments for the dollars that we have to spend.
So I'm going to go ahead and call the question, but first note that later in the same meeting, we're looking at the capital improvement plan, the CIP, and you will see some numbers in there that relate to possible electrification. Is there any further discussion on this item? Okay, if there are no objections, we'll consider this a motion unanimously approved to recommend this to the full board. Are there any objections? Hearing none, it passes unanimously. Thank you very much. We'll go on to the next item, which I guess is discussion of pictometry interlocal with Whatcom County.
Excuse me, Chairman Lilliquist.
Skip something?
I just wanted to let the record reflect that committee member Scott Cortice is in attendance. So we do have 5 board members now.
In the house. Okay. Pictometry is, Josh, will you be handling this or somebody else?
Yes, good morning. Hopefully you can hear me well. So this is a regular interlocal that we enter into with Whatcom County. It's part of a regional effort that Whatcom County has led to provide aerial photography and the results of that photography out to all of the local governments. And so we pay a little over $2,200 to have access to all that photography and to help pay for the photography of that. And that's what this interlocal does.
Board members or committee members, I mean?
I move we recommend this to the board for approval.
Second.
Would it be the preference of the committee that this go on the consent agenda or on the regular agenda?
It's $2,500.
If there are no objections, we'll please ask this go on the consent agenda. And we have a motion. If there's no further discussion and there are no objections, we'll consider this passed unanimously. Are there any objections? Thank you. Hearing none, that passes unanimously with 5 voting for. And the next item, please. Which I believe is
it's mine too. So
okay, go ahead.
Yeah. So it's that time. Like most of your government agencies, we utilize a lot of Microsoft software here, and we pay annual maintenance for that. A lot of it's actually moved to subscriptions through the Office 365, and we've also moved a lot of our infrastructure up onto cloud hosting and doing some other things like that. This is essentially a renewal or a new 3-year agreement with Microsoft and our associated value-added reseller, CDWG. For an amount not to exceed $750,000 over the next 3 years. This has been budgeted, and we've got approximately $240,000 in year 1, $250,000 in year 2, and $260,000 in year 3. Those amounts are subject to staff growth, as well as how much our actual usage is up in the cloud for Microsoft Azure.
Okay, thank you. Hey, I got a question, Josh. How do we feel about subscription-based services compared to the model that was used, 10 years ago, 20 years ago? Is that a use? How do we as an organization, as an end user, feel about that?
Yeah. Well, as an IT director, I've actually been moving more things away from a periodic capital intensive model to an ongoing expense model. And I think the subscription model helps support that. It provides a more even expense anticipation or a cost to the overall IT efforts and makes those things more visible. I'm concerned that when we do annual or a periodic large capital investment, it starts to kind of confuse and hide the actual costs. And so this makes them more transparent. There are pros and cons with any subscription model. Overall, the costs tend to be about the same, actually. In fact, we're moving to a slightly different license this time around, and our subscription costs are going down, I don't know, like 1% or 2% or something like that. So it's got its pros and cons, but so far it's worked well for us. And it's been about break even to what we were before, where we would do a large periodic capital and then ongoing software maintenance at a lower price.
Okay, thanks for answering that question. Committee members.
I have a follow-up on that. So, I mean, there's other cons. The big one, it's Microsoft. And then in terms of the subscription stuff, and I'm going to totally defer to staff on this. But the subscription things, at least the other organizations I work for, it seems to occasionally outstrip the hardware that you have. The required software updates on the subscription model. But is that actually an option? You can does Microsoft still let you do the old? You just buy something and it's a fixed piece of software that doesn't continually update and change.
I believe it's still technically possible to buy some things that way. Yes. A big part of our subscriptions is not just the software, but also them hosting all of that stuff up in the cloud. So, for example, the Office 365 subscriptions include our email system Exchange Online, our intranet SharePoint, as well as a couple other services that I no longer have to have staff trained in to run on site. And so for a shop our size, not having to bring those things in-house and worry about, the 2 a.m. phone call that Exchange our email systems down, stuff like that, kind of pays for itself in that way.
Committee members, is there a motion?
I'll move approval of the full board.
Second.
Is there a preference for this going on the regular agenda or the consent agenda?
Consent's fine with me.
Yeah.
I'm going to recommend putting it on the consent agenda because A, this is a renewal, and B, it's a recurring budgeted expense. So it's not really a decision point. If there are no objections to that, I'm going to call the question. If there are no objections to the motion, then we'll consider it passed unanimously. Are there any objections to recommending a renewal of the agreement for Microsoft Enterprise Services? Hearing none, that motion passes unanimously. The next item is also, I think, you, Josh, discussion of Trapeze annual maintenance purchase.
Yeah. As part of Trapeze software provides the bulk of the software that operates our service on a day-to-day basis. It handles the call scheduling of paratransit riders. It handles our Linden Hop, the website and the interactions that they do there, as well as all the scheduling of our transit operators, the design of our service, who's supposed to be doing what each day, tracking their time and effort as well. It's a large suite. We pay annual maintenance on that software that we've purchased over the last nearly 2 decades. I bring this forward each year to remind the board of the overall cost. It is part of an existing contract that we have with them. These costs are, and this is the purchase order for that at $234,000. And this is a budgeted expense.
And I'll move approval. Doesn't sound like we can live without this one.
I'll second.
Thank you. A motion for us to approve the purchase order for the annual maintenance for the trapeze software. Again, is there any objection to putting this on the consent agenda? Okay, no objections to put it on the consent agenda. And are there any further discussion? Hearing none, if there are no objections to the motion, we'll consider it passed unanimously. Are there any objections? Hearing none, that passes unanimously. Thank you very much, Josh. And now we will switch to discussion of the capital improvement plan. I think this is probably maybe the most significant item in a sense that has a longest look ahead. Mr. Boslow, do you want to begin, or Les, do you have any comments before we start?
No, sir, we can turn it over to Mike. And I think we can have discussion as it goes forward. Thank you.
All right, good morning. Staff is requesting executive committee recommend the board of directors approve the 2022 six-year capital improvement plan. This plan will be used to develop the 2022 transit improvement plan, the 23 capital budget, and for long-range planning purposes. A little bit of the background, I'll try to skip through it a little bit. We formed this in 2017, and we have projects submitted to the CIP committee for scoring. And we look at ranking for compliance of correcting an identified issue and or enhanced health and safety requirements, renewal, which is our state of good repair of existing assets and or reducing our maintenance backlog, enhancement of projects intended to expand agencies' geographical reach, enhance the value of our current services, and or procure additional assets. It also includes our WTA 2040 goals and strategic alignments. So the CIP is including both projects required to maintain the agency's state of good repair and advance our agency initiatives. There are projects on there that are specifically focused at grant opportunities that WTA would not pursue with local funding alone. We'll be using the CIP for during the development of our 2023 capital budget. This year, we also show projects that are unfunded from the WTA 2040 plan that are in the planning stages. So we do not have them ranked yet, since the questionnaire cannot be fully answered until the scope of the project is developed. But this is intended to reveal the potential future budget items that would be funded in our annual budgets.
Josh, next page.
Pardon me?
I'm asking Josh to show the next page.
Thank you. There you go. The CIP is a living document that's updated annually and approved by the board annually. There are projects on here that are regionally significant and grant funding needs to be on our transit improvement plan that will be submitted to the Whatcom Council of Governments. The CIP is also a key component in the Transit Asset Management Program, which is an FTA program requirement that's submitted to WashDOT and reviewed during the FTA triennial review. So a very important aspect of it. So looking at the schedule, we added a new column. We have our typical budget requirements for each project, but alongside that, we added a column for the cost for electric buses. This is a total cost for those items. It's not the differential between diesel and electric, but it's the total cost. So the board could see that and see how that compares as we move forward in the future. The other projects have the same budget down below. So it only is a differential for the electric vehicles. moving through it, we show a couple of items. Lines 7 and 8 are our paratransit bus orders from 2021 and 22. I carried those forward to 23 due to issues with the supply chain, specifically with Ford. Lack of production of chassis that's really impacted the industry. And also the state contract is in negotiations with the vendors, and that will be hopefully renewed in June. So hopefully we'll have a budget cost, could be increasing there for those items. But right now, I don't see having vehicles being delivered in 22. So both those have been carried forward. And the replacements for 23 were actually moved out for 2024. Then we have a gap year, so hopefully we'll catch up by then. Moving down, we have our lines 14 through 17, which are van pool. I added the discussion of the type of alternate fuels. Those will be in the future that we're just now in discussion that could be updated with different technology in the future. We don't have anything in the budget planned for next year, but in 2024, we start again showing replacement of those vehicles. Lines 18 and 19, we are looking at our bus stops, replacement of the shelters, another state of good repair, and the bus stop improvements, which brings our bus stops into ADA compliance, which is 50% funded by the city's TBD. So those funds will be spent in the city of Bellingham. The WTA funds will be spent countywide. We have facility projects for Bay 2 lift, which is another carry forward, along with line 22 wash bay detail booth. Carried those forward because of the, again, supply chain issues. Very difficult to get competitive pricing right now on facilities projects, and delays on scheduling, which we're seeing on our existing project here at Moab for our second floor remodel. A 3-month project is now spread over at least 6 months, and we're still waiting for equipment. So this would help us let the industry catch up, and we'll hopefully get those completed next year. We are in design of those and trying to get those ready for next year, so we're ready to go. Other projects, we moved up line 27, Moab first floor expansion, into design for next year, along with the North Lot development phase 1. So that will be started next year. Down below, we show the 2040 future projects that are there for the board to see what those costs could be as we develop them in the future. And then on the very bottom line is the total for each project, or for each year, and a total budget over the course of 6 years. And with that, I'll turn it over to questions.
I got a couple.
Yeah, if I may, Todd, first. So one way to read this document is look at the totals below that first section, 58 million versus 84 million. That's the increment for the estimated increment for electrification. And then if you compare the 58 and go straight down, you include the WTA 2040 item, that 96 million, that would be what if WTA pursued all of the WTA 2040 visionary projects, right? So there's the competition there. We could stretch beyond business as usual, sort of sideways from 58 million over to 82. We could stretch again, in this case, downward from 58 million to 96 million to add those. And so those are the things that are in tension. 58.5, that's business as usual. And then those others are what WTA potentially could do. So there's the decision that I was talking about. There's the context for fleet electrification in tension with the other significant initiatives looking ahead over the next one, in this case, 6 years. Does that seem like a fair characterization, Mr. Bozzo?
Yes, very good. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Todd, you had a question or comment or?
Yeah, I got a question. I'm trying to figure out how to read this chart. So like line 2 and 3, is that because there is no electric increment on line 2? Are those the same thing? That's just one of my questions.
Well, line 1 are the electric buses that we have a state grant. They are in order and will be delivered in January. So we have to show the budget in 2023, but those are already been approved by the board and on order. Line 2 and 3 are the same buses. Those are, line 2 is if we just did the existing purchase of the 8 diesel buses. In line 3, I did separate line for those to be increased to electric vehicles versus the other lines I kept horizontally difference. But those, since we already have the diesel ordered, I kept it separate.
Gotcha. So then like line 18 on the bus shelter replacement, that would be, I'm assuming like there would be charging stations that would add the extra 282 on top of that.
Oh, I think that's a incorrect number there.
Yeah, because I don't get why a shelter would cost more if you have electric.
Yeah, those lines 18 and 19 should be the same across. I'm sorry, I got an error there. I thought that was correct.
I see you have your hand raised. And by the way, I hate to say it, but can we stop sharing that screen just so I can see everyone? I can't tell who wants to speak, but Shonda, you have your hand up.
Sure, Michael. I just wanted to add on the document we were looking at. Those are just replacement vehicles. So if WTA chose to increase service and expand service, there would be expansion vehicles we would need to think about too. So just one more aspect to throw into the decision mix.
And that's a good point in looking at like the BRT, that those are capital costs. Those are not operational costs that would come with expansion of a BRT system. So that's a good point. Thanks, Shonda.
So I think that's sort of my editorial comment, which is that we do have, as Mr. Donovan has pointed out, healthy financial picture going ahead. We could throw that at fleet electrification, but we could also throw that at many other service-related needs. And yeah, I mean, we sort of have that information in front of us in this preliminary form in a document that's not really meant for that, but I think it's showing us kind of the decision or where the decision would play out. Todd?
Yeah, I'm still confused by this chart. I mean, like line 9, 10, 11, 12. Am I reading this that the replacement of those propane buses on line 10, 9, 10, etc., it's the exact to the dollar cost times 2 to get an electric bus than what would be budgeted otherwise?
No, those are still propane buses. The only electric vehicles are the fixed route.
Okay.
Right now, we're still looking at replacing para with the propane vehicles.
Okay, I get it now. Back to Michael's question. So what are we looking for right now? Are you saying we want to make a decision at this moment about whether we invest 82 million versus 58 million for electrification, or is this something we would do staging in, or is this just an informational thing to give us a sense of this is what it will cost for electrification?
So what we're looking for on this is moving the CIP forward for the 2023 budget. The rest of it is just to show into the future years how we would structure this and to provide, as we go into discussions with the board next week and into the future, this tension, as Michael highlighted. We have these various things that show how, while we do have significant cash at this point, it will be spent down, and there's going to be decision points, policy decision points for the board on, do we invest in transit-oriented development and BRT and those things, and how. So the zero emission bus transition plan is one component of that, and how it works with all these other potential expenses on that. So all we need for this is just to move this forward to adopt the CIP for next year, and then this will form the foundation into the future for these discussions on that tension.
So
If
it
that helps.
is sort of odd that we're approving a document with at least two significant what if scenarios indicated. What if electrification and what if WTA 2040 initiatives?
The 2040 initiatives will not be really part of the CIP. They're just there for the board's information. It will not be, used in the tip yet, because we still have to develop those projects. So the CIP is only through, line 33, actually. We're just showing the bottom as reference.
Okay, thanks for the clarification.
So it's a very useful planning document. It's not like we're making the decision right now on 2040 full electrification, et cetera. So I would recommend this to the full board with the corrections on line 18 and 19.
Thank you.
Change.
And I'll support that, knowing that it keeps all of our options open. And I guess one other useful thing somewhere is maybe how much it really will cost WTA's cash flow if we get grants from the federal government and maybe grants from Move On Washington.
If I may, another reason I should say, we have the electric vehicle costs on there is because we're applying for grants, and they need to be part of the tip for those grant requirements. So that's exactly part of this, is making sure that we can apply and for grants to defer those costs in the future.
Okay, we have a motion before us to recommend approval of the CIP to the full board. Understanding, as Mr. Donovan put it, this is a planning document that will be used to seek funding and also to develop the actual budget. If there are no objections, we'll consider this passed. I am assuming this should not go on the consent agenda. I think it's definitely a main agenda item. Are there any objections? Hearing none, that passes unanimously to be brought forward to the full board. Let me look at my agenda. The next item is discussion of rescheduling a public hearing on the Transportation Improvement Plan, the TIP.
I think I'm going to take that one, Michael. Okay. So good morning. And yes, we are asking to the executive committee to recommend that the board reschedule the public hearing that was originally scheduled for next Thursday to the June 16th board meeting. The TIP is the document that Mike was referring to that we need to have our regionally significant and federally funded projects on. It will go to the COG for approval in July, it'll go to the COG by the end of July, and then we'll go forward up into the state TIP. And based on the conversation we just had with the SIP, we talked internally that we really needed some more time to take a look at the CIP and how that flows into the TIP. And that additional month will allow us to produce a more accurate and thought through document for board approval. And then we will still have the opportunity and the time to meet the requirement from the COG to submit that on time to that organization.
It also built in a little bit of time for the board to consider the TIP, and if there were public comments and those kinds of things coming forward too, that it gave us a little more wiggle room than what we normally would do.
Committee members?
Move we approve it to the full board consent agenda.
Second.
Thank you. We have a motion before us to recommend agreeing to reschedule the TIP public hearing to delay it 1 month. This would go forward to the consent agenda. Is there any further discussion? Hearing none, are there any objections to the motion? Hearing none, that's passed unanimously. Thank you very much. We'll delay that for 1 month, give us a little more time. And now we'll go on to discussion of approval of the April expenditures. Looking for a motion here.
Move approval on consent agenda for the full board.
Second.
Is there any discussion? Hearing none, are there any objections to passing the motion? Hearing none, that goes on the consent agenda with recommendation for approval. And now we go on to executive committee structure discussion. Mr. Reardons.
Yes, so we have carrying over from last month, we had talked about, is there a better way to use the executive committee's time moving forward? I think this is highlighted some of these things that that get passed forward. We talk about them here and then at the full board the next month, and that generated from the executive committee an idea of, hey, let's take a look and see if there's a better way to more efficiently use time. So we talked last month a little bit about a couple courses of action options, about keeping it as is, trying to simplify the bylaws into kind of constrain down on what came to the executive committee. Or one of the other things we had talked about was, do we switch and go to 2 board meetings a month? To try to drive down the length of the second. Right now, the second board meeting tends to be long as we're talking through the things we just talked about in the executive committee again. And so would moving to 2 board meetings a month at 1 hour each, would that allow us to simplify things and move things forward in a quicker, more efficient manner? So that's what we were hoping to talk about, on if there were ideas from the executive committee on ways to streamline and make it more efficient. But those were some of the options that we had come up with.
Oh, sorry, committee members.
I don't know how this would work, but there's some of these things that we just quickly put onto the consent agenda. Whoever's setting up the meeting, the agenda for this meeting, is there a way to anticipate that and just put those on for the full board? I don't know how that would.
Well, right now, the way the bylaws are is we're supposed to bring these things forward and get the executive committee's approval to move them on. And while some things we know, usually the expenses and approval of minutes go on consent agenda. Others, it's kind of at the executive committee's discretion to make that recommendation. Like, for example, today we had a couple high dollar amounts, but they're recurring, so it went on consent agenda. I mean, I guess we could develop criteria to set forth to move to consent agenda, but at this point, it's hard to predict.
I'm sorry, go ahead. Who was that?
Sorry. I'm just with other regional transportation boards, is this the general way they operate with an executive committee and then a full board meeting, or is it again, just a variety of hodgepodge? Or
it's a variety. Vicky kindly surveyed, I think it was 13 or 14 other transit agencies, and they're kind of all over the board, from one where they have something similar to this. Others have subcommittees, finance, operations, those kinds of things that meet kind of like a city council model. Well, they'll do the work sessions and then make a recommendation to the full board, and all the way to the other extreme where others just have one board meeting, longer board meeting once a month, to plow through everything. There are pros and cons. Some of the lessons learned out of those. The one meeting a month is that if something gets continued over, you either have to have a special meeting to do it quicker, or you have to wait a month. And so from a planning perspective, that's there. And looking back at the minutes on how our executive committee at WTA was formed, that was one of the reasons, was to have a executive committee kind of do a truth check and see if there was more work or things before recommending it on the following week on that. So that would be one of the downsides. The subcommittees, what we heard from that on lessons learned is that it requires a bit of time from board members to do, and then you end up in the same kind of thing where then they have to bring it to the board, and then other board members. We've heard a lot of them end up attending the subcommittees, even though they're not on the subcommittee, because they want to hear what the discussion is so that they can make an informed decision at the full committee. So it didn't really save time. It just made it a little bit more of a working committee on that. So that was one of the reasons why we were looking at maybe doing 2 board meetings a year or 2 board meetings a month at shorter time periods, because we can knock out a lot of these routine things pretty quickly. And then you could have a second board meeting that was more of a work session to give more time, particularly as we move forward. The CIP highlighted it's Michael, I think rightly said, this kind of tension going forward. So there'll be some discussion that we need to have, and on these various programs, whether it's fair policy or so forth. It could build in some time to have more substantive discussions as a full board. Obviously, we need to get the county exec and Mayor of Bellingham to agree to another meeting, but.
So I've been thinking about this a lot. There's a couple things I think I'd like to achieve. One is to eliminate the duplication and the rehashing. And the other thing I would like to achieve is to give room for full discussion and not a hurried agenda. And keep our meetings within their allotted time. Generally speaking, this board has, any board like ours, has 2 functions. One is oversight, that we check on what the administration is doing. We approve the contracts to make sure that significant actions pass by the board's eyes, so we see what's happening. I view that as an oversight function. And then the other function for a board is the forward-looking planning, the holding of the vision, the creating of the vision, the shepherding of that vision. And ideally, if boards are high functioning, they spend more in the second half than the first half. That boards shouldn't remanage the management. Right? That's not our job to remanage the management, but there's an oversight function, which is a little bit like remanaging, right? What I would suggest is that the executive committee serve more an oversight function. Everything needs to go past the board's eyes, or at least the executive committee's eyes. Okay, but this is kind of like we would be the executive committee. Main job would be to see which things can go right through to the consent agenda, so that the second full board meeting has more room for things which have long-term consequences. So the CIP is a long-term consequence. We need room to discuss that planning document, that forward-looking document. Whereas approval of the trapeze software is necessary for oversight function, that go past us, but not all of us and not twice. So what I would suggest is keeping the executive committee structure and the full board structure, but avoid the duplication by understanding the roles. So that, for example, potentially the CIP would not even have been scheduled for this meeting. If it was really to be a discussion item, then it would come forward once at the full board meeting and there'd be room for discussion rather than twice. Whereas trapeze would come forward sort of twice, but really once, because it would be moved on to consent agenda. And I'm sure there are gray areas, and that's fine. That's my recommendation. How do other people feel about that?
I guess I'll pipe in. My camera's off, but anyway, I guess if we would have, I think we could accomplish it all. It's interesting, 2 board meetings a month, because then things are happening more often. And I think we'd accomplish all of that because we would not see a step twice. We'd only see it once. And very important step, we could get some detail at one meeting and push it off for 2 weeks for a decision. The only question is the executive and Bellingham's mayor willing to do an extra meeting a month? Otherwise, your plan sounds good, Michael.
Okay, I saw Ally raise her hand and then Todd.
So I agree. I think either way we go, 2 meetings a month are important. You know, I know there's a lot of things that can come up in the first meeting that don't come up in the second meeting, which if we did 1 meeting a month could end up being a 3-hour meeting, which I don't think any of us really want to do. And, you know, having a month between things, especially if something's urgent, and then having to kind of scramble to get us all back together, you know, and it's not scheduled in advance, could be harder. So yeah, I agree with Scott on that, if we can get everyone else on board. Otherwise, if we can't, you know, I like having 2 meetings because sometimes it brings up questions and, you know, like, how else are we gonna create more work for Mike Bozzo? No, but you know, it's just sometimes that discussion brings up things that we wouldn't have thought about, you know, and I think about the electric bus discussions, like there's been a lot of that happening. And I feel like if there was only 1 meeting a month, you know, we'd be, I think, waiting longer for those answers and not really thinking it through as well, maybe. 2 cents, those are my 2 cents.
Todd?
So let me just be clear on the proposal. It'd be essentially having 2 board meetings a month and no executive committee meeting.
That's Scott's proposal. So Scott's proposal and mine are similar in that they keep 2 meetings and they attempt to avoid duplication. In my model, we would try to actually shift the content, so it'd be slightly different between the 2 meetings. In Scott's, if I understand you, there wouldn't be a necessary difference between the 2 of them, but you wouldn't double load them unless an item deserved to be visited twice. It would come forward in one of the 2 board meetings, it would be disposed of, and it wouldn't need to come back again unless it was a continuing carryover item. Scott, have I characterized that well, do you think?
Yeah, I think that's what I'm, yeah, 2 meetings. And if it's not like this dip today, you might want to have it discussed pretty heavily today, and then you think about it for 2 weeks and pass it. Whereas the other stuff, you review and pass it.
So the main difference between the 2 proposals is that under Scott's model, we really would want the mayor and the executive, the full 9-member board there in both occasions. And if that's true, then we can treat them as equivalent. We can avoid duplication, but there are basically 2 meetings and they're equivalent. And the executive committee would be dissolved. We'd need to change the bylaws because we would no longer be using that. Under mine, we could keep, I think, the current bylaws and the current membership.
Okay, I could go either way. I guess I'm kind of leaning towards Scott's idea. I don't, from a representation, oversight, policymaking perspective, I don't understand how having 2 additional elected officials makes it a substantively different kind of meeting. Even if it's the executive and the biggest city's mayor, how does that really substantively change who we are and what we do? I've never understood that.
Well, they're far wiser than we are, so that's why.
So how about if I take for action talking to the county exec and the mayor of Bellingham and see if they can commit to that, and then report back, and then we can make a decision in June.
Do I see head nods?
And I'd like to push back a little bit, you know, kind of on what Todd said. I feel like we could move forward with either of these ideas either way, you know, either they show up if they can or they don't. If we have a quorum, it's a quorum, you know.
Yeah, I agree with that.
So I think the consensus is 2 meetings is necessary given the work we're doing. We definitely want to avoid duplication. If the executive and mayor agree, then we can just dispose of items. There's no need for the consent agenda tool to move things ahead in the second meeting because we just dispose of them once and never have to revisit them. So we would continue very similar meetings where we'd have what I would call routine oversight items as well as board discussion items. I could go either way as well. As long as we avoid duplication, I think everyone will understand. I think the executive committee structure, unless we do something different in this meeting than the next one, then there's no reason for it. There's no reason for it if it's just a mini board meeting.
And if Seth Paul and Seth can commit, we can revise the bylaws to get rid of the executive committee, have the 2 board meetings, and then it goes to, as both Ali and Todd said, as long as there's a quorum, the board's authorized to take action, whether even if Seth Paul or Seth couldn't make it to that one of those meetings.
Les, can you do me a favor? Could you write up an email on this and make sure to send it to the entire board? There's also executive committee members who aren't here. I want everyone to understand that we're either contemplating a different use of the executive committee structure or going to 2 meetings. But either way, we're hoping to avoid duplication.
Yes, sir. I will summarize this discussion and send it out.
Are we feeling good about that, everyone? Okay, thanks so much. That's been bugging me for years. We now go on to the 2 reports: first quarter financial information and ratios and the first quarter performance reports. Shonda, would you like to begin?
Certainly. Good. These are our Q1 reports for 2022. And we reworked this report a little bit to add in some more visuals to address Paul's request and maybe take some of the ratios that maybe weren't very helpful. So the first one's operating revenues to operating expenses. We are a little bit below our objective of 80%. We're at 76.4. No need for concern at this point. Revenues tend to come in a little bit slower in the beginning of the year, while expenses are a pretty steady drumbeat. We are seeing increase in fuel costs, so we're going to be watching that over the years. Mike provided that in May of 2021, we were paying $2.10 a gallon for diesel, and now we are paying, as of March, $3.85. So we'll continue to take a look at that. The second speedometer is actual expenses to budgeted, and we're at 85% of that. Part of that is a timing with wages and benefits for the COVID safety payment that was paid out in April. That's about $715,000. So it's not considered a March expense. We paid it out in April. So a bit of a timing component there. This new graph is in here just to give a visual of sales tax revenue quarter by quarter. So you're seeing we're 15% above last year for Q1 and a little bit above our budget already for this year. So again, Aaron's tracking that and the different components that make up sales tax revenue, but just wanted to provide a different visual for you. These both are also new, just 2022 year-to-date revenues and expenses. So you can see in the revenues, the largest portion are the sales tax revenue. And then we did our first request for ARP funds of a little more than $6 million that we'll expect to receive this month. To reimburse salaries. And then year-to-date expenses, you can see the larger components are salaries and wages and then our employee benefits. So again, those ARP funds will be targeted mostly to reimbursing salaries throughout this year. Then we move on to the cash graph. And this again shows the changes in both undesignated cash and our designated reserves quarter by quarter. You can see the increase from Q1 of last year to Q1 of this year. Again, part of that will be the ARP funds and then the timing of when we received both the CARES and the CARISA Act. So next week, I'll present an annual report of cash and you'll be able to see how those dollars flowed in more evenly. The graph below is just the summary you've seen before of the different types of CARE Acts and the Federal Relief Act. So the ARP will receive that in May. And then we move on to the income statement and the balance sheet. So on the income statement, we've talked a little bit about the revenues coming in. They're just a little bit below budget. The ARP funds, we didn't draw down as much as we had budgeted. And also sales taxes a little bit above our budget. On the expense side, the salaries and wages and benefits are below budget. And that is really a timing issue that we had. And then really all of our other components are under budget except for fuel. So we'll be continuing to watch that. So we had a good quarter with net income about $1.7 million more than we had anticipated. Capital expenses under budget. Mike talked a little bit about some of those projects that have been delayed, and we'll go ahead and I'll prepare a summary for that too. We'll have some cash impacts for some of those dollars that will roll over from this year into next year. And then on the balance sheet, just to draw your attention to the cash and cash equivalents. So that is our cash that we have liquid to spend, our undesignated at $16 million. And then we have our restricted at $20 million. So we're sitting at cash right now at about 37.4 million. At the end of 21, it was 38.8 million. And that's grown about 8 million from the end of 2019. So we're seeing some of the impacts of those relief funds. 22 has that large dollar amount coming in. So I expect we'll see additional cash growth by the end of this calendar year. Everything else on the balance sheet is pretty standard and consistent, except for those odd numbers for GASB, the pension asset and the pension liability. Reporting tools only, they're not really a cash impact. So I'll leave you with that. I appreciate any feedback. If you like the change in the report, if there's something that you want to see explained differently or talked about in a different way or more information, I'd be happy to chat with you about that or receive emails on that. And then I'll just open it up for any questions.
I got a question on the year-to-date revenues, with 44% being the ARPA funds, and I think you said that's going to go backfill salaries. So we're only getting that for a few years.
We will get that for this year. We'll draw all of that 21 million down this year, Todd, and it will be it's on a reimbursement basis. So we'll pay the salaries and then we request the reimbursement.
So next year, or years going forward, when we don't have that funds, the revenues, so I'm looking at that pie graph where it's 51, 44. In the next year or two, then those revenues paying salary will just be coming out of our reserve. Where do we make up the difference? That's going to be coming out of the reserve.
Correct. You're absolutely correct. That orange 44% part of the pie will go away in 2023. And then we'll be relying on our sales tax revenue and our cash reserves to go ahead and pay those salaries. So in most years, those are a pretty close match, sales tax revenue to salaries and benefits. If it tips to where wages and benefits start to outweigh the sales tax, we'll need to be drawing on our reserves to cover those expenses.
I think what's misleading is the upper pie chart is actually bigger than the lower pie chart. That is, revenues at the moment are exceeding expenses.
Correct.
So that pie can shrink and it is still big enough.
Correct.
I'm just guessing that any changes in sales tax are going to be somewhat minor compared to the change in the ARPA funds.
That is correct. Okay, is there any more questions? Thank you.
Okay, performance report.
Okay, that'll be me. Just moving along to this first quarter 2022. I think the main thing here to mention is completion of the long range transit plan, WTA 2040. Thank you so much to the board and the staff for helping make that happen. Exciting to have that 18-month project done. Feeling much lighter today than the last 18 months. So you also see in this quarter hiring positions. I expect you'll see some of those as we move forward into future quarters with some of the hiring decisions that are being made here over this next year. So moving along to the next page, Josh, not a whole lot to report here on the performance data. We are seeing a gradual increase in our ridership. You can see there with that first quarter 2022. That's kind of building on the fourth quarter of 2021, where we began to see some recovery of our ridership, Western riders as well as others beginning to return to service. We're just about above 50% of our normal ridership at this time of the year. And you can see our performance passenger per hour is beginning to recover as well for both fixed route and paratransit. Vanpool remains about the same as it was over the last few months. So that really hasn't changed much. So that's pretty much it as far as performance. I will mention that one of my staff, Michael Harpool, will be working on looking at increasing the number of metrics that is really an outgrowth of WTA 2040. We mentioned looking at some equity measures, and we may consider bringing that to the board too as part of this reporting mechanism. So stay tuned for work on that over this next year. So I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have about this data. Okay, hearing none. That's it for this.
Okay, that's the last scheduled item. Is there any further business for the WTA Executive Committee? The soon to be defunct Executive Committee?
No, sir.
Okay, thank you everyone for being here. We'll see everyone for the full board meeting 1 week from today. This meeting is adjourned.